on that we have been working in it for a while, but have not been officially launched, which is Global Index on Responsible AI, which we are very, very close to start the data collection. And we think that this could be a very interesting context to think about these connections, these links between open data and AI, the purpose of this meeting. So I will share my screen with a very brief presentation that will help me to go through the most important aspects of this project. So the Global Index on Responsible AI is a project of the Data for Development Network. It is led by Research ICT Africa, which is a think tank based in South Africa. Most of the team is distributed to Africa, and a couple of us, we are in Latin America. Also, the project has the support of AI4D and funded by IDRC Canada. So the main, let's say, the starting point of the Global Index of Responsible AI is the challenge of measuring the evolution of commitment and progress on implementation of responsible AI principles and practices. So to do so, we start asking some research questions. Do the conditions exist to support and promote the responsible use of AI? And what does progress look like? Can we track it over time? These were like the main ideas when the project was started. So then we divide into 4 objectives of the responsible AI. So first, to establish a systematized human rights-based benchmark for responsible AI. Once that's ready, to assess country conditions to support and promote responsible AI. This assessment at country level will cover more than 100 countries around the world. When we have that ready, that this will happen later this year, the idea is to provide evidence to decision makers around the world to advance the responsible use of AI and promote digital inclusion. And this is as a means to realize principles through implementation, evaluation, and so these are the main objectives of the project. So as we mentioned, one of the objectives is to establish this human rights-based benchmark. So one of the first tasks was to define responsible AI, which is a contested term, and there is a lot of literature and bibliography around it. So we have the whole team has condensed it in our conceptual framework, which we can summarize into 2 main concepts. So the development, use, and governance of AI in ways that fully uphold human rights and democratic values throughout the AI lifecycle and value chain. And also, the responsible development, use, and governance of AI requires every step to be taken to ensure our planet and our communities are not adversely affected by this new technology and are used to benefit human development and democratic engagement worldwide. So this is like the starting point. Then I will share this URL with you where we analyze more than 100 existing frameworks and we share with the people so they can easily access to them and see what's the background of this conceptual definition. So then if we want to assess responsible AI at the country level, we have to operationalize that concept also with sub-concepts from the conceptual framework that I was mentioning before. So we have broken down the concept of responsible AI into 4 dimensions, which are at the same time they split into sub-dimensions. So we have the first 3 dimensions that we are going to assess collecting primary data. Our researchers will assess the evidence at the country level, and the 4th dimension, which we are going to use secondary data, which is more a readiness dimension. So the first dimension will track human rights and AI. The second dimension will track responsible AI governance, and the third one, national responsible AI governance. These dimensions are going to be measured through 3 types of indicators that will collect 3 types of evidence. Government frameworks, this means what frameworks are in place in a country to address pressure issues regarding responsible AI. What are governments doing towards responsible AI? Because there might be some framework in place, but this is not implemented or governments are not doing enough to make it real. And we have also realized, and we have seen many of the discussions of the responsible AI, that government states are not the only key actor here. So we are also tracking non-state actors' activities towards responsible AI within civil society organizations, private companies, multilateral organizations, and many other actors that could be involved, academics, etc., that could be working towards responsible AI. So this is a little bit the structure of what kind of evidence we are going to be collecting to assess responsible AI throughout the world. Another aspect that I think is very important of this project is that we are building a global research network. I know that some people here is familiarized with the Global Data Barometer, which is a project of this, where we also are developing a global research network, which is composed of regional hubs, which are civil society or academic research organizations localized in different parts of the world that they will coordinate, recruit, and validate the data that the country researchers are going to collect and to assess. So we are building a network to have we have seen, for example, in some efforts to collect data worldwide, where languages is an issue or where knowing exactly how the country works could be a challenge. So that's why this decision, which has different reasons. One is methodological, so every person collecting data in a country knows precisely the country. And also for the sake of building a network and spread capacities across the knowledge and the research toward responsibility. Another aspect that I think is also related with today's meeting is that all the data that we are going to collect to analyze is going to be released as open data for reuse of any purpose, and then it also has the opportunity to other investigators, other researchers to make their own indexes based on the evidence that we are going to assess, and we are going to open those assessments to be very easily to work with for everyone. And then to go into the final step on the presentation, I just would like to give a quick glance of what topics regarding responsible AI we are covering in the survey. So the dimension and sub-dimension that I mentioned before are composed by these thematic areas, and where we are going to be able to do a very detailed zoom in on, for example, what's happening in each country regarding education and responsible AI. We're going to look for frameworks regarding laws, policies, strategies regarding AI and education. We are also tracking government activities if there are plans for upskilling in secondary education or in primary education. And we are also be tracking what non-state actors are doing towards education and AI. We see that in many places, some private sector companies deliver courses or they are doing some joint ventures with governments to promote education toward AI. So these areas that you are seeing on the screen are going to be addressed by the Global Index of Responsible AI to be able to do a sum in and have more details. So this is a brief overall of the project. Of course, we can keep discussing if there are any questions, concerns, or anything.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Nicolás. That was great. I'm always fascinated by the way the Global Data Barometer and other benchmarks are able to summarize the impact of specific measures like something as obscure as AI and convert that into something that's usable and informative for people in terms of how responsible we're being with the use of that technology. So I have questions about what those intersections are between the Global Data Barometer and this specific benchmark, but we'll get into that at the end. Right now, we'll move on to our second speaker. I believe Stefaan is with us now. Hi, Stefaan. So Dr. Stefaan Verhulst is the co-founder of the Governance Laboratory, or the GovLab as we commonly know it, which is an action research center focused on transforming decision-making using advances in science and technology, including data and collective intelligence. He is also co-founder and principal scientific advisor of the Data Tank based in Brussels, a do and think tank that focuses on how to reuse data differently to serve the common good. On top of all of that, He's renowned for his contributions and influence across academia and civil society around the world in the areas of research, data governance, digital government. I mean, we all have the same 24 hours in a day that Stefaan does, but he manages to get so much done and accomplish so much with the time that he has. So again, 7 books written, writings appearing in all sorts of publications that are prestigious across academia. And again, he speaks fairly frequently at events like ours, including TED, the UN World Economic Forum, UNICEF, the OECD, and many others. So thank you, Stefaan, for being here. You're a longtime friend of the ODC, and it's always great to have you come address our members. Over to you.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Wilfreda, for this longish and quite often undeserved introduction, and delighted to be here. Great to see all of you, and thanks, Nicolás, for this wonderful presentation. Also, I mean, talking about someone who produces a lot in 24 hours, I think Nicolás, tops probably our list here as well. So I will briefly reflect on an emerging area that we are working on, and we recently also had an event, and we are also developing some additional actions, which is really about, anyway, where generative AI, which is, of course, the topic of the day, and open data might intersect. And I also, not as nice as Nicolás, but developed a few slides, and I hope you can see my my slides as such without seeing everything else that is open on my desk, so I'm not embarrassing myself here. But so what I will reflect on is what's the emerging kind of understanding on how generative AI and open data can actually serve each other, right? To what extent can generative AI, as we call it, can it generate kind of a fourth wave of open data? And some of you might know that a few years ago, we advocated for a third wave, which of course was leveraging a lot of your, all your efforts as well, but trying to put it in a framework so that we could understand that this is actually an iteration and that open data is evolving as we speak. And the question that I seek to address today is that will open data also evolve as a result of generative AI? And from our point of view, there are a few emerging use cases and value propositions as it relates to generative AI, call it ChatGPT or BART or other kinds of platforms that are currently leveraging large data sets in order to then, through prompt engineering, provide answers to some of the prompts that you might have. And I think the first one, and from my point of view, it's the most exciting one, kind of use case that we might see, is where generative AI might actually become the interface with open data, right? Where in the current environment, a lot of the interface with open data is quite often limited to open data portals. It requires some kind of sophistication in order to actually make sense of the data. And you cannot just ask a question and get a response back, right? And so what we might see here is actually a transformation in how you engage with open data. And so through a chatbot or through other kind of more customer-friendly or, anyway, as you could say, citizens-friendly kind of interfaces where you could engage with open data as such. That's the first use case that we could imagine. But what is interesting is that ChatGPT or generative AI is not only good in reacting to a prompt, and again, we all know the limitations, of course, of those as well, but it can actually also generate code. And it turns out it's actually not bad in actually generating routine code for certain kinds of actions. And so what we have seen already in some places where actually generative AI can generate code that means that we can actually democratize how we engage with data without requiring sophistication in, for instance, Python and other kinds of platforms or packages that you need to have typically to actually engage with the data. And so that's another big area. We also have seen that it can actually automate some code books so that, anyway, if you work in an organization and you want to use open data, you can actually use ChatGPT to enhance productivity as it relates to the creation of codebooks. And then ChatGPT has also already been used to generate synthetic data so that actually you can make more data open, right? In some cases, certain data sets cannot be made open, but if you turn and move it into a synthetic kind of environment, then you could actually have more open data as well. And we also have seen certain kinds of advances in actually how generative AI is able to tag data, create metadata as such. Now, all of this needs and requires a whole lot of red flags, right? Because anyway, while it cannot replace human coders. In many cases, we also have seen that even if it generates code, some of the code might actually not be up to the task. Similar as some of the responses to any kind of prompt might also not be similar. But we have already seen a few kind of interesting things that are emerging. So this is just one example called Census GPT, which is still very clunky and actually limited. But if you go to censusgpt.com, there you will be able to see how, for instance, an interface could actually, based upon some prompts, like for instance, what are the richest neighborhoods in Houston? And so what they have done is that they basically trained the API of GPT on census data, and then you can start answering those questions by just having access to the census data in Houston, for instance. Sorry, I'm getting overwhelmed, but or the other questions like 5 cities in Florida with the highest crime. So there you could actually see where you even have correlations between 2 data sets, right? So the crime data sets and then cities, for instance, in Florida as such. And so you see this kind of emergence of an interesting interface that makes access to open data more democratic, in the sense is that you can actually query the data in user-friendly kinds of language. Now, and again, I suggest you go there. The real concern, of course, as I said, there's a lot of red flags, but actually the first concern is that most of the current open data can actually not be crawled through with AI crawlers, for instance, right? Which means that you cannot use it for even ChatGPT, right? So you need to, there's going to be an increase in not just, declare victory when you have an API, but actually now, if you really want GPT to actually start leveraging your open data, and more importantly, potentially even have your dedicated GPT for your open data platform, then there's going to have to be an investment in making open data crawlable and also structure it and index it in a way that makes sense for actually the AI applications. Also, actually, what we have seen is that because if you start using open data, potentially for even training data for GPT, it is super important to have high quality data, right? Because garbage in, garbage out is even more pronounced in a ChatGPT environment. And so that's the other big element, is that actually, if we are moving to the so-called fourth wave, quality of data is going to be more important than ever. Then also, this is about prompt engineering, and I have written a piece about that as well, is that ultimately we all knew that, of course, the value of data depends on the question that you seek to answer. And by prompt engineering, it's even more important, right? Reflecting on what's actually the question that you seek to have an answer to. And so we need to, as I have been advocating for, invest in question science, not just data science, where we actually understand what are actually the questions that matter for a particular kind of element. And then it's going to be crucial, some like Bing does this already, ChatGPT does not, is to be able to actually document where the data came from. So data provenance is going to be super important, so they actually know, if this is the answer, what was the data set that was used. And it's interesting, Census GPT, for instance, does that, right? You have a few others, recent GPTs like Perplexity, some of you might know, is another GPT search engine. that actually does this kind of sourcing already. But I think it's going to be super important to establish trust, to know where the data originated, or at least what data was being used for the training as well. Now, this is just an emerging field, and I think there is more questions than answers. But I think as an open data community, I think we do need to take this on with comprehensively, because otherwise it's gonna be taken by surprise on how ChatGPT might actually change the way we go about open data, or how open data is impacting the way we go about generative AI. And again, there's a whole discussion to what extent has generative AI a long kind of lifespan. Some already indicate that actually the current way ChatGPT or generative AI is developed is not sustainable. But at the same time, we do need to think about, for instance, what are the value propositions, right? I mean, I've just given you 5 examples, but there are many more examples. And can we get, I mean, it would be interesting to have like kind of a generative AI meeting where everyone brings their example and how they have been using generative AI for open data. But also we need to document the beneficial, but also the challenges of generative AI. We need to understand the requirements for social contract. As some of you know, I've been advocating for a social license, where we actually, especially if we want to use, if we want to align the output with expectations of society, then we need to actually think about what's the social contract. And of course, how do we increase data availability? What does it mean to actually make data crawlable? How do we upgrade our platforms? How do we make sure that we describe high quality data, and so on? So I'm not going to go through all of these, because you've heard already enough from me to say is that there's a lot, a lot to be done, Wilfreda, in that space. But I think, as I said, if we are smart, it can actually advance the value of open data in substantial manners. But we're going to have to become rapidly far more sophisticated on how we do so. And I'm going to stop here.
Great, thank you. Certainly a lot for us to think about in terms of those 5 opportunities that you outlined, those use cases of AI and how it relates to open data. The one that really resonates for me is the idea of leveraging AI to make data more accessible, which makes me wonder how we can leverage it in the, like, for equity and in helping to bridge that data divide. But I also hear that this idea, to take advantage of that, we need to address some of those 5 considerations that you mentioned before we can even get there. So thank you again, Stefaan, for the insights that you offered. And I look forward again to the chat at the end where we're asking questions. With that, we'll move on to Gloria Guerrero. Hi, Gloria, and welcome. Gloria works at the intersection of democracy, technology, and human rights. In the last 10 years, she has designed and implemented digital transformation and open data strategies for local and national governments, co-developed civic tech initiatives, and managed multi-actor alliances to support democratic innovation. Before joining ILDA, she worked in Latin America coordinating Pulsante, a regional fund and mechanism to expand civic space and increase inclusion and representation of traditionally excluded voices and communities. She holds an MPP from the Hertie School of Governance in Berlin and a bachelor's degree in international relations from Tec de Monterrey in Mexico City. Welcome, Gloria, again, and the floor is over to you.
Thanks, Wilfreda, for the introduction, and thanks, Nicolás and Stefaan, for your presentations. Were really insightful. And I hope my case will also prompt some questions related to open data and AI, because I'll present a specific experiment that we did at a project in ILDA. As you know, ILDA is a Latin American initiative for open data. For during 20 and 22, we implemented a project connected with to answer the question of how we could use AI for the public good in the global South. And it was specific questions, trying to address the specific questions related with these topics. And the first one was, what is the relevance of open data in AI development? What was the current state of the art in terms of data in the global south? And can data-intensive technologies like AI contribute to solve public issues? And if so, how? For this, we know now that, as I think Stefaan also mentioned, like all your algorithms are as good as the data you have. So here it was crucial to connect what was the current state of open data in the region to develop specific tools to address specific topics. So Empatia was built under the idea that we have this big challenge in Latin America in terms of how to understand the harnesses of AI, but also what will be the right policies and design practices to attend specific issues. And also this was really connected with how we could strengthen, on one side, open data initiatives from the government, and to understand what data we have and how the data could be used for specific pilots, and what was the availability of that data. So the three components of Empatia were first, governance and policies for development to understand what was going on, and we did a map and a research on that. Also capacity building, like training civil servants. We train around 40 public servants in 15 countries in Latin America, and specifically more than 1,000 in Uruguay with a specific training material that was online. And the other component was the impact of AI in critical sectors. So for this component, we run a regional open call, and we selected nine AI initiatives. The initiatives that were selected are connected with different topics, and they are all of them were developed with open data and with this condition of being transparent and collaborative. So the whole process was oversight by the community of practice, and all the information was public information that the government had on open data portals. So we had projects related with open justice, public procurement, air quality, and also in Argentina, a project that was measuring like on time the air quality. Also some projects in Brazil connected with access to information to try to counter-arrest the impact of fake news and misinformation. And also this specific project, Querido Diario, has been selected as part of the forum for the Nobel Prize as an innovative practice and an innovative project for civil society to counter-arrest fake news and hate speech. So it's something that we're very proud, and we are very happy to having worked with the Open Knowledge Foundation in Brazil to develop this project, because it's having a really good impact, and it's like being used especially under a very polarized context. Also, we have other projects connected with air quality in Chile, and another one connected with health and access to health in Mexico. It was this specific platform algorithm to identify and to avoid like chronic diseases, and how people could get the right treatment on time. So basically the whole thing around Empatia was based, as I mentioned, on collaboration and co-production. So we developed this roadmap that is based on agile technologies. And here the idea is like, once you identify the problem and you identify who are the relevant stakeholders, you can look at the data that it's already available, and then you can try to bring everyone to the table to find like the right solution, like using AI. So you develop the prototypes, you test them, you prototype, then you launch the product. And the idea is like to always being reviewing the information that you have and the data. It's not that you design that like for one time and then you see, like having this open process where you can adjust, and especially where you can identify which data is missing, and because we know that data points are people. So also is to understand who is not part of the problem, who is not there, what data is missing, and also to create recommendations for the government to understand how and when, if you bring that data, like the process can be improved, and that will obviously have a positive impact. On the policy side, we had like three main conclusions that open up new questions, but also are opportunities. And we found out that obviously there is a like fertile ground for a human rights centered approach to AI, but the institutional and political environment might not be favorable in all countries of the region for this. So this is something connected with civic space, democracy, human rights, and it's not that you're gonna be able to develop the technical part of it if all the other conditions are not in place. So if we want to develop AI for good or for public good, those things need to be aligned, and we need to have a connected agenda. It's not just advocating for the technical side in terms of open data and accessing information, but it's also addressing the issues of the lack of inclusion and the lack of human rights guarantees that are sometimes happening in some countries. There's also evidence around algorithms that are already already operating in the public services, and they have limited oversight, and this is problematic, especially in the security and military sectors. And also the investment in open data is limited, and now it's more necessary than ever. We have seen, like, as we can see, and Nico is here in the Global Data Barometer, that open data initiatives are not as popular as they used to be, like 5 or 10 years ago. And the budget for many of these portals has been reduced in some countries. So this is something that we need also to keep an eye on it. And other opportunities and like how we can move forward and what's like new opportunities for the sector or for academia, civil society. We saw that strengthen existing efforts to generate mechanisms for the purchase and execution of transparent AI systems. We need to keep an eye on that, like how it's been done and who is involved in those processes. Also, the use of open algorithms in the public sector. And these will benefit like the auditability of the processes. So it's something to keep an eye on too. Establish a registry of algorithm systems that are being used by the government, and to make a benchmark around countries. Also, that can be another idea. Develop capacity in public officials and civil society organizations to monitor the evolution of these tools. And it's just not, and again, it's not just the technical part, but also to understand the political, social, and economic impacts of the algorithms that some governments might be using, and to generate monitoring and supervision structures that integrate multiple actors to work together. So we will continue working as we can on, like, we are designing like the next phase of Empatia, and the idea is to continue working on ethical and legal standards, how those are being developed and who is developing them. The data governance mechanisms. Also, it's important to remember that data, it's not just entry points, because some power relations are reflected on how those data sets are developed. So now more than ever, we are advocating not just for transparency, but for inclusion and representation, because that impacts the data that it's feeding the algorithms that are making decisions. Also working on the capacity building, on education, on AI for all sectors of all sectors, not just government, academia, or we think tanks and organizations, but also like for citizens outside to understand the impacts of these new technologies, especially in the public sector, and to keep pushing and advocating for cross-cutting diversity and inclusion policies in all the journey of these technologies. So I tried to be brief because it was a project that lasted like 2 years. As I mentioned, we're like 9 countries and 8 different initiatives. So, but in general terms, those are our main learnings and findings in Latin America, developing and implementing these pilots, very specific pilots for specific topics. So thanks.
Thank you. That was very, very efficient. Stayed right on time, yet very informative. Thank you again for such a comprehensive overview of your data governance and policy development approach, particularly the role that education and advocacy plays in that process. And So this being a forum for just that, we can open up the lines now to have questions for the panelists from the members. I have a few of my own, but we'd love to hear from you. If you'd like to pop it in the chat or raise your hand and jump right in, that's okay as well. I don't have my eyes on the chat. There is one comment from Christian at Open North. I'm happy to read it for you, Christian, but you're also welcome to speak yourself.
Sure. Yeah, I guess it's more because we've been thinking a lot about well, from the data governance perspective, how AI comes into play, and I think like we always keep banging our heads against a lot of the questions that are being raised about AI as an industry. So thinking mostly about the environmental concerns, and when Stefaan was presenting, it was like, okay, cool, yeah, open data, black box nature, that's great, that solves some of the problems on like where the data is coming from, but it still doesn't address the sheer amount of resources that any large computational model will take. And then so thinking how that fits into, I don't think it's implicit at this point, but like in the open data movement ideal of being more environmentally sustainable, contributing to climate resilience. And I don't have the answer. It's just like a question that, well, I'm a nerd, so it bugs me at night.
Stefaan, I see your hand up. You'd like to respond?
Yeah, no, I totally agree with Christian, is that I think one element that the open data community or the data community in general and the AI community is going to have to take into account as part of good governance or good data responsibility is indeed environmental stewardship as well, right? You cannot, my view is that you cannot do data stewardship without also thinking about environmental stewardship as a result of how data is being used or how AI is being trained. And I think this whole decarbonization of data space is a space where I think the open data community has a unique role to play because it's also not just about not understanding the value, but also how do you actually go about leveraging data in a way that it doesn't contribute to a massive footprint, environmental or greenhouse gas footprint. And from my point of view, actually reusing data is in the environmental stewardship kind of environment. It's not just about collecting more data and storing more data. It's about data you already have. How can we reuse it for other purposes? Might actually be environmental more sane than continuously feeling like we need more data, right? And I think that's a kind of one area where open data brings to the table is that, and I think that might be something to really explore. Does open data actually, from an environmental point of view, is it less taxing because you reuse data that was collected for one purpose for other purposes, as opposed to collecting more data and storing more data and needing more computational power? Now, the other element, so two quick other elements. One is that it's actually quite interesting to see that the latest open source models of generative AI, which especially have, as you know, it's very interesting to see that Meta has basically opened up its generative AI model, right? Unlike BART and ChatGPT, Meta has decided to give its model to the world. And that in itself has generated a lot new open source models of generative AI that basically don't require the training anymore that the original model, like Llama for Meta or ChatGPT for Microsoft or OpenAI and BART, of course, for Google, basically they don't require that kind of high intensity training anymore to fine tune the model, which, by the way, is why I think my hunch is that that's why OpenAI is suddenly freaking out, because till now you needed so much computational power that there were basically only 3 companies that could do it, right? And that was exactly, anyway, Meta, Microsoft, and Google, because the amount of computational power basically creates an asymmetry in who can develop a generative AI model, right? So it's not only an environmental stewardship issue, it's also a power asymmetry because you need the amount of computation to actually do this. And now that we move to open source open source generative AI models, that might actually not be the case anymore. But it could also be used more because you had those three that controlled the space, and as a result, you had more oversight of the space. But now that it's open, that's why they are also freaking out from a governance point of view on how it might actually be misused. And so, so yes, environment for sure. I think also thinking about, anyway, what is open source? Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? It definitely, anyway, democratizes access, but at the same time, it also makes it much harder to control, frankly, on how it's going to be used and developed as well. And I think those elements are kind of interesting to explore.
Yes, absolutely.
Well. Sorry for being long-winded.
No, that's okay. It really does highlight that risk, with opportunity comes risk, and we have to try to find the balance in between, and that's the work that we're all here to do. I want to give Nico and Gloria a chance to chime in. If there's anything you'd like to add around the idea of sustainability and environmental considerations for open data and AI.
I think I will be like super brief because I am seeing more questions on the chat. And I think, yeah, like under this perspective of just like not just talking about the technical part. I think it's not just the environment impacts of AI, it's also the political impact, the social impacts. And I think we need to talk about this more broadly. When we talk about a specific topics like open data and all the possibilities that AI presents for the sector, it's amazing, but they cannot be seen in silos, right? So we have to also, like Stefaan mentioned, like to try to think about new ideas and being innovative, not just in the terms of how we're gonna like guarantee that these black boxes are more open, but it's not just about transparency. It's about all the other like roads that are open at the same time. And I think that's the most challenging part, but it's important to mention it and to remember that we need to have a broader perspective of this new ecosystem opportunity and advancement of humanity.
Absolutely. Nico?
Well, no, I think that Stefan answer was pretty comprehensive, also great Gloria's comment, but highlight the importance of the comment of Christian to bring these topics to the table and all this new challenge that comes with AI. So, yeah, the community can help to face it.
Thank you. So we do have quite a bit of questions in the chat. So I'll start with Eduardo's question. How do you suggest addressing the steps between open data and AI that deserve to be strengthened, such as data quality and relevance, and the role of the private sector in sharing data in an open format? Who'd like to start?
I can jump in. I don't know if answering exactly this precise question, that this is a very good question indeed. Just wanted to comment that yes, these are not new topics that AI brought here, but are some challenges that were on the field and AI is facing, other uses of data were facing this before. So the issue of the data quality or non-biased data was here before the deployment of AI, but with the intense use of data for AI, it was highlighted on the power that these uses of data have and the impact brought with more strength these topics to the table. And also before the rise of the hype of recently, we are being discussed the data flows between both private sector, government to private sector to government. There were also a lot of ways to address this on the table. Again, I have not a direct, concise way to answer to this question, but I think that at the moment there are like many years ago that there are a lot of ideas and movements toward this topic.
Thank you, Nico. Stefaan?
Yeah, Eduardo, meaning ultimately, I think AI has provided for one more reason to make data open. So in the past, we had value propositions like open data for transparency, open data for innovation. Now, without data, AI basically, anyway, cannot exist, right? And so that's another, from my point of view, another fundamental reason why open data should be advanced is, anyway, if you want to advance beneficial uses and applications of AI, then I think we should care about open data, but also we should care about preventing, again, as I mentioned, those asymmetries or those power asymmetries between those that have data and those that don't have data. And those that have data, surprise, surprise, have been in the forefront of developing AI models. And think about certain private sector players. And so it's in order to deal with this asymmetries and to advance equity and inclusion, we also need to start thinking more about opening up private sector data so that the AI models can be more inclusive and that actually the market of developing AI for good solutions can be more competitive and more inclusive as well, right? And I think, so all those reasons for actually making data more open from my point of view, and that's the connection as well.
I imagine it complicates things. It's that added nuance of having the private sector data. There's, again, what you spoke about in terms of having less control. The wider we open this up, the less control we have, the greater the risk. How do we balance it all? Gloria,
yeah, well, that's where governance comes in, and I think,
yeah.
And again, all of this can be done, right? It's complicated, but it's not unfeasible, and especially thinking about, anyway, governance in a way that is fit for purpose, because depending on the purpose, you will have different kinds of stakeholders that need to be part of the governance structure as well, right?
Gloria, I'll give you a minute to respond, and then we'll keep going because they are a lot of questions.
Yeah. No, I just would like to point out the idea that we cannot also rely only on the good faith on the private sector, right? Like mentioned stuff like Meta is like publishing their code and about what they are using, but at the same time, we need to guarantee like the policies and legal frameworks for them to do so like all the time, not just because it's a good thing for publicity or marketing. So also, I think that's important to advocate for, like to guarantee that they are going to publish the information, and they're going to publish, sorry, the information in open formats.
Mm-hmm. It's another great point. So Nadia's question is AI for policy development and governance. Can we talk about government 3.0, continuing of O'Reilly's idea on government 2.0?
I mean, happy to take that as well, Wilfred, but I don't want to dominate this thing here. So, so we are actually working on a report at the moment on how AI can be used for evidence-based policymaking. And so ultimately, if you think about policymaking, it's a staged approach, right? So you have agenda setting, identification of problems, prioritization of problems, ideation about solutions, testing out, experimenting certain solutions, implementation at scale, enforcement, adjudication. So there are a whole set of actions that involve policymaking, right? And from our point of view, AI has a potential role to play at each of those actions, right? Such as, for instance, how can AI be used to actually make sense of public input, right? At the agenda setting stage, right? I mean, as you know, I've written about where AI and where artificial intelligence and collective intelligence meet is actually a sweet spot for policymaking, right? So because most policymaking, anyway, there's public input, but there is no way to make sense of the massive public input if it is massive. And so AI can play a role there. It can play a role in actually synthesizing existing evidence, right? Systematic reviews takes a long time. AI can actually improve how we go about learning what we know and apply it to policymaking. So there's a lot of use cases there, but equally, anyway, none of this can be done, first of all, without actually upgrading our existing policy infrastructure or anyway, policy makers for that matter, but also with then, of course, adequate oversight as such, right? The real challenge, of course, anyway, what O'Reilly thought initially was this automated decision-making, And I think we all know that that's not really where we want to go to, right? I mean, AI for just, anyway, delegating decision-making is probably a bad idea, but in strengthening decision-making and augmenting it might be, anyway, a better idea.
Agreed. Thanks, Stefaan. We have a specific question for Nico from Paul. I was still waking up and missed what you said about Creative Commons. What is the measurement in regard to Creative Commons? If you could repeat that.
Yeah, sure, briefly. No, we are not measuring that. I was saying that we are going to be publishing all the data in reusable format with a friendly license, so anyone can access, explore, and reuse the data in an easy way. We are not measuring.
Okay, thank you.
As a follow-up to that, Nico, could you tell us a little bit more about the overlap between the Global Data Barometer and this new responsible AI benchmark, where sort of they meet, or if they meet at all?
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, there is like some institutional overlap. They are both projects of the Data for Development Network. The research network that we are building also overlaps a lot with the Global Data Barometer. Also, some people involved, like me, there. And then there is a conceptual that this is something that we are still working on. You know, in the previous edition of the Global Data Barometer, there was the intention to start measuring some topics related to data and AI. We included some questions regarding algorithm decision making, regarding usage of AI with open data. So there was this initial idea, and we started developing that as the Global Data Barometer. Now, in the Global Index on Responsible AI, you know, data is, as we are discussing now, is the foundation for AI. So we are going to use the Global Data Barometer, the secondary data sources to track data for public good in the world and availability and government data. However, we know that it's not enough. So we are also including some thematic data. And we are also next to a next edition of the Global Data Barometer. So we are still but exploring the best way to complement both measurements, because there are obvious connections with this, but with both of them keeping their singularity, their particularity. So this is the topic that we are still working on.
Thank you. Great. So we have about 3 minutes left. I did want to see if we could squeeze one more question in, and that's from Cesar. Please, can the guests comment about cases of fighting corruption or improving integrity with AI? Which are the challenges or good examples of success in that matter? And I'll give you 30 seconds each, naming one good example that you can think of to close us off. We'll start with Gloria.
Yeah, I think I'll mention two, but super quick. Like one, it's from Ojo Público, like this news outlet in Peru. It's called Funes, and they did an amazing job developing an algorithm to track possible corruption cases. And another one was part of Empatia. It's called Licita Bot, and also what's an algorithm in Bolivia, trying to open up and to understand what was going on in terms of open contracting. And I think for those examples show that AI, it's very useful to track and to understand and for public procurement oversight. And I think one of the challenges, it's resources and scalability. Sometimes these initiatives, they end up like just being applied in one country, in one context, but the idea of like replicating them in other contexts and other countries sometimes is tricky because of the specific legal frameworks. But I think it's something that we should try to solve for the future, like how we can scale these solutions.
Okay, thank you. Stefaan.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of examples, but the one that I always like is the use of data and AI to assess lifestyles of public officials. As you know, we have a lot more traces right now that public officials leave with regard to their lifestyles, right? What car do they drive? What house do they occupy? how do they spend their time? Anyway, are they yet another cruise ship or not? And that can all be used to actually reflect on whether they can sustain a lifestyle on a government paid job, or whether that's a red flag with regard to corruption. And I think we see a lot more of those kinds of lifestyle assessments by assessing and analyzing public crumbs that public officials leave that actually might be a red flag. And I think AI has done a lot of that kind of, anyway, has made this much more easier to do, which in the past required some kind of investigative kind of journalism, right?
Great, wonderful, thank you. Nico, you get the final word.
Yeah, regarding to this particular question, yes, there are like many cases. One that I have been heard about recently is interesting. I think it's here in Argentina that they use satellite image to detect buildings that were not approved to build. So that could be like the starting point to investigation on corruption. So,
Great, thank you so much to our panelists again for being here. Thank you all for taking the time to be part of this meeting. One quick announcement is for those who applied for our civil society position, thank you for all your applications. We will be formally welcoming our new civil society co-chair during our next meeting. Again, keep the conversation going throughout the month, and we'll see you next time. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of the day.